So welcome to the Ecological Assessment Case Study. My name is Carolyn Gadet, and I'm the manager with the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. I'll be moderating this session today. Just a reminder to mute yourself, because this is a meeting and not a webinar, so we can hear all of you. There we go. So I'd like to start by stating that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain, and I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. So before we get to Stephen's introduction, I just wanted to explain how things are going to work today. Stephen will give a presentation about this new ecological assessment that he's developed, and then there will be time for questions. During the Q&A period, you can raise your hand to be called on if you want to ask. Oh. There. I just muted all. Mute all. It's not working. Anyways. There. That's better. You'll have to unmute yourself, Stephen, when you're ready, but okay. Where was I? So you can use the raise hand feature, which is in, I think, the reactions button, or it's just the raise hand feature. And then after the Q&A period, there'll be a short break, a short bio break, so you guys can go to the bathroom, get a snack, whatever. And then we'll meet back and Stephen will go over the activity again, and then you'll break out into groups. There'll be 3 groups and you can choose which group you'd like to go into. And then to ensure that everyone's getting the most out of the case study, we would appreciate if you actively participated in the breakout rooms. The breakout room discussions will not be recorded. And then after the discussion, the breakout rooms are done, everyone will regroup and there'll be like the conclusion discussion portion. And so we understand that you might have a lot of work to do and you plan to listen while also doing your work, but in order to kind of improve the experience for your fellow participants, we would appreciate if you were engaged in the activity. And if you're busy this afternoon, then you can work through the activity on your own time. Just some housekeeping. You can hide like the session and the dashboard on the left of your screen, or you can hide the feedloop Q&A and presence detector that's on the right to make the screen bigger. And if you want to type in the questions for the Q&A, you would have to do it in the Zoom Q&A box, not the feedloop one. So the feedloop Q&A and chat box will not be moderated. So you make sure you put those questions and any issues you might have in the Zoom chat and Q&A, or chat, I guess there's only a chat box. But if you have general comments about the session or the workshop or for like networking purposes, those can go in the public group chat in feedloop. All right, that's good, we're done. So now to introduce Stephen. Dr. Stephen Tanis has been working within the environmental industry for the past 20 years. He has extensive experience in reclamation, ecosystem management, rare species surveys, rangeland management, and wetlands. Stephen has been propagating native species for over 20 years as part of Eastern Slope Rangeland Seeds and owns Tanis Conservation Services. He has worked on numerous reclamation projects restoring ecosystems across Western Canada, including restoration of fescue grasslands, bioengineering stream banks, forest reclamation, and alpine reclamation. Dr. Tanis teaches plant identification and wetland classification courses. His PhD established a method for reestablishing foothill fescue, making it a viable species for reclamation. And he has won the Alberta Emerald Award for individual commitment in 2001, as well as part of the TCS team in restoring fescue grasslands in 2014. And so before Stephen starts his presentation, I just wanted to let you know that the gamification code for this case study is Tuesday. So you can put that into your gamification and get those points. Go ahead, Stephen.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, as mentioned, so I'm presenting on ecological health and range health, and then some new reclamation health assessment protocols that I've been working on. And so I'm going to be thinking through kind of what I've been doing, some background on it, some then I'll go through the details of what issues I've run into in reclamation and assessments and range health assessments, and why we've kind of built these new assessment protocols. So just as a background to start at the beginning here, understanding what health is, all organisms can be measured with health. Biological organisms, we're looking at the ideal functioning organism. And when we look at rangelands, ecological health, we're looking at a suite of a group of organisms. And is the system as a whole functioning? So instead of thinking of the cells in your body, we're thinking of the whole body of combined. Rangelands, understanding that rangelands are your extensive ecosystems that are really managed extensively, not as intensively, and a lot of our natural systems. And what makes the ecological health a little different from the range health is we're focusing not just on grazing, but in looking at some of the other functions in the health of systems, such as browsing. So many systems we have this issue where we have browsing and no grazing. So how do we adapt our system and make sure the health assessment protocols are suitable in those situations? So I tried to expand out the number of things we could assess in health. What is range health? Terms refers to the ability of rangelands to perform key ecological functions. The function of a healthy rangelands include functional diversity of plant species, plant community composition, primary production and structural layers, nutrient cycling, water cycling, soil stability. And so you're looking at a whole function of how the system works as a whole. So reference communities, and these are important to take note of. To really assess in health, we have to have a benchmark we're looking against. So if we don't know what a healthy body looks like, we can't really say if you're healthy or not. So you have to have a healthy system. And so having some reference communities developed is important and will always be part of this process. And so just, this is from one of the guides from Alberta. There's many guides. And if your jurisdiction doesn't have complete guides, there are usually some type of plant community formations that you can get to help with that. So general things you're looking for is a general species list with the mean range in cover. So here on silver sagebrush, we have 1%, 0 to 13% in the community, and constant is 28% of the time it's there. So those are the key things. You're kind of looking at those type of metrics. When you look at guides, they'll have some other useful information, some of your stocking rates. Be paying attention to how, if they do tell you how many times they've been assessed. This one here is 100 times. It's a pretty good round group, but I've had plant communities formed on one assessment point. And then you have to say, well, there could be a lot more ranges of issues. And then you have the forage production. So when we look at reference communities, make sure when you're assessing health, just the background, you need to be thinking about where you're located. Calgary is a great location where we've got 3 natural subregions intersecting within the city. So be paying attention that just because you says you're in one natural subregion doesn't mean you don't have a community from a neighboring natural subregion. These lines on the map are not fixed lines. And so you have to make sure you understand that. Different aspects, a north face could be at a more moist natural subregions plant community than a south face. So you have a very different functions, just what you're looking at in habitat. So what I'm going to do here is break into the reclamation assessment protocol. I'm going to run through it kind of quickly for you to understand what's in here. We're going to then break into the discussion groups afterwards, and we'll have 2 discussion groups that are going to go through the reclamation health assessment protocol, and then one that'll look at the ecological health assessment. And then if those groups finish with their area, they can flip over and discuss the other assessments. So everybody's going to see everything, but you'll have one area that you're focusing on when you break into our groups. So vegetation assessment quality, we really have to look at our plant community composition. So the first question in the reclamation really replicates what we see in the other health assessments. And we're looking at our composition. And in restoration, in the first year, you can't really look at cover because there isn't cover, but you can look at the density of plants. So how many seedlings do we have showing up in the plant community? So I've got a scale here, and this is where our discussion points will be is this suitable? Does it need to be higher, lower? Do I need a table for different natural subregions to address this? In the 2nd through 4th year, and that would extend onward as many years until you're able to move into a normal range health assessment or ecological health assessment, you would assess under this system, which then looks at cover, and it really replicates what we see in the other health assessments, just it's out of 15 instead of 40, because in our early years of reclamation, I put a lot more points on soils and our soil composition, layers, because if we don't have those building blocks set up properly, the whole site trajectory will fail later on. So we aren't focused as much on plant communities, so we have less points here, but we do care about, is our climax or late successional species, the dominant species you want to see in the community based on our target community, present? And it could be a reference community, so you could go to one of those guides for your reference, or you could be creating your target with no reference because you have no surrounding plant communities to replicate. So you choose your target, and then you're assessing on how well you're meeting towards that target. In question 2, we start looking at the layers. And this is out of 10 points, and we're looking at, are all the expected layers present? So we seeded in these layers. If we're expecting to have some shrubs, some forbs, tall grasses, short grasses, medium grasses, did your seeding actually, or your plantings, actually net you what you thought you were getting? So are you on track? And this is where you can score that you're missing some layers, or you're missing multiple layers. And this would then trigger you to want to do some adaptive management to help fix that situation. Then looking at years 2 to 4, we've expanded that to really just look more into the cover, and are we getting to that target community? So just a little more detail, and we have a little more questions focusing in on that. Hydrology and litter, again, this is the same question as the Alberta guide, and there'll be some debates on, do these need modifications? Saskatchewan, Manitoba, there's been some changes in their health assessment guides, and we will compare those later on here. You expect in year 1 to have a 0. That's just an expected. So there would be certain things, but years 2 through 4, you should be building litter, and you should be moving through 13 and up into 25 by year 4. Evidence of site stability. Again, exact same as our normal health assessment protocols. Looking at erosion risks. Bare soil, again, it's very similar process-wise, but expect in year 1 to have 20 to 50% at the best bare soil, exposed soil. So you're not going to get down to 10% just because it takes time. So the protocol is built to kind of move over time. So this is where we have the new questions. So I went into topsoil depth, breaking into full marks to have 90% or greater, 7 points for 85 to 95%, 3 points for 75 to 85%, and 0 for less than 75%. Basically, we're saying you need to have that building block to your topsoils. If you don't, it's going to stunt your community. It's going to take a lot longer to recover. And you may not get the same community. You might have to switch trajectories completely. soil compaction. So the next step is going through soil compaction. And we have 10 points for being similar to the compaction and soil densities offsite. And then as we go through higher compaction rates, then we drop our scores. Soil structure, looking at admixing, looking at, do we have the same textured soils? Sometimes we have soil additions that happen. Many things happen. And so you could go from a clay on the control sites and you're in a sandy soil. If that is negatively impacting the plant community and the structures, then you want to reduce it. The only thing is sometimes you can be improving your structure more than your control sites. And so you do have to take that into account and not docket for those. So noxious weeds, the same as the other health assessments, and I'll discuss those a little later. And then in the forested one, we have a little different protocol in the beginning, but the end result, all the last steps are the same. So in question 1, we look at our tree density. And so tree density is a little different than in seedling grass density. So we're looking at basically 2,000 stems per hectare target and dropping as you drop below that. And that is something we could have discussion point. Do I need that higher if you're putting shrubs in there? Or do we need a split between trees and shrubs, separating them out into a table for different environments? As we get into year 2 to 4, we have the tree stem densities and the trees and shrubs, but we want to see ground cover forming in this. And so do you see the proper ground cover coming in? And is it of your native colonizers or is it just weeds? And so you dock it if it's mostly weeds. So when we look at our other health assessment protocols, we have a number of other considerations. So our existing protocols are really for established grasslands, forests, shrublands, wetlands. So there are some things that have happened over the last 20 years that we have been noted to be issues that we need to work with. So litter, assessing excess litter has not been something that has been included in the Alberta system. I know Manitoba has now, with their new one, added litter into it. But if we have excessive litter, it can actually shift our plant communities. We can have weed establishment, and that's a problem. We do not address woody invasion left. So if a plant community starts shifting because you have aspen encroachment, Douglas fir encroachment, ponderosa pine encroachment, what happens is you can go from a healthy grassland to a healthy ponderosa pine stand with needle litter underneath it, and it just stays healthy. We never actually dock it for the fact that we lost an entire ecosystem. So we need a way of addressing this as these shifts are happening, to identify them and to address them. We don't assess browse and uplands. And I run into this when I was working in Elk Island, Prince Albert National Park, and we were finding that the largest vegetation ecosystem impacts were from browsing, not grazing. And so we needed to really find a way to assess the impact of browse on shifting the plant communities and the structure of the plant community systems. We do not look at decadence in the mature woody stands. So if you've got mature pine trees and spruce trees, there's been no fires and they start falling down dead, we aren't addressing that. And so with Parks Canada, I looked at fuel loading and some of the risks associated with it. And if we can tease this out, it can be a useful metric to understand more in how we need to manage our systems. We do not have a protocol for shrublands. Are they a grassland or a forest? What do you do? So if you've got some willow groves, or if you have an Elaeagnus stand, there's a number of different ones. Some of them are more grassland, some of them are more forest. What do we do and how should we assess them? So I came up with a shrubland assessment. So excess litter. So what do we need to deal with? Really, litter is core to nutrient cycling, water cycling, our organic matters in our soil. It's really a building block of our system, but we really don't have a clear system when it becomes too high. So if no grazing occurs, I see this in urban parks, in federal parks, even our provincial parks, we have no grazing and our systems are not built for no grazing, and we have degradation of the ecosystem. And this leads to actual shifts in our plant communities. So our plant communities can shift from their climax kind of composition and late successional composition to basically monocultures of a climax species. Rough fescue is an example of that. And then as that extends, you actually have rough fescue plants dotting and just dead matter. And they actually, then a lot of the rough fescue plants will die out, and you end up with just these big bare areas. You have a fire come through and suddenly it's not even a climax grassland anymore, when you realize you've lost a lot of your climax species and they've been suppressing themselves, choking themselves out. So addressing this, I actually looked at this as something that should be addressed in question 1, where we're looking at the plant community shifts. And I looked at potential of putting in a question. In Alberta, we go from 40 to 27. So I looked at 32, where I get something in that 8% reduction for the loss of biodiversity on that initial stages. So you're catching it as the climax community is still there and functional, but you're seeing suppression of biodiversity loss. Then how I am addressing it is, you move down as you've got more and more severe, your plant community is going to shift away from the climax. It'll no longer be your climax community. You're going to start seeing shifts with weeds, and you'll move down this in more severe conditions. But generally, it's only the first one's the only one I've really seen in significant account. So that's kind of how I've addressed it in my assessment. In Manitoba, they're using in their litter question, so theirs is out of 20, not 25. And so they get about a 7% reduction here, and a potential another reduction down to 6. So they can go twice as much as I have. So that's a question, is which way should I be going? As we're refining these type of assessments, maybe we can find something, or maybe I need this one here, the litter, as well as that first one where we're looking at the plant community suppression. And this one here, in my view, I'd put in a table for litter production and say, well, if it's at 150 or 200% of normal, we're going to dock it for that, because it is excessive. That would allow us to assess this before the plant community shift, and hopefully address this problem before we have those shifts in the plant community that come on that question 1. So that's basically what I wanted to address here. That'll be a discussion point. The next one is, we do not look at woody invasion. And so I actually came up with a question, and I pulled some points out of our structural assessment, so in question 2, and made a subcategory in question 2. In the forest one, I did that. In the grassland, we just added this question. So this is a standalone question, makes when it's applicable, you assess it, and you're assessing the whole score out of 110% or points instead of 100. And it just looks at, what percentage of normal? So when we go back to this guide, and says, well, normal is 0 to 13%. Well, if we're 20%, well, we're definitely have had a 5% increase in our shrub, and that can be suppressive effect. And so if we're within the 5%, then we'd stay at full marks. But then when we start getting 5 to 15%, then we would start docking it. So say on this one, we've gone up to almost 30%, like 25% shrub, then you'd start calling that out as there's a shift happening. I didn't make it as much for the normal shrubs of the community, but more for novel ones. So aspen encroachment into grassland, those type of situations. So that's where maybe there might be some explanation around what this is focused on, what species we're focused on for this. So definitely something to consider farther. And then I look at the distribution of those woody species. So the specific species we pick out as a problem, what is their distribution? And using the normal distribution tables. If you've got just a few individuals or one patch, that's not the same as having multiple patches or having a continuous spread. So you might have low cover, but if they're everywhere, it can mean that the ecological shift is going to be much more dramatic when it starts to really happen. Now, use of woody vegetation. So this is a question 6, which I added in, and this is pulled over from the Riparian Health Protocols the cows and fish have put it together in Alberta. So I'm basically just pulling the riparian assessment for woody species in the uplands, and it has a not applicable on it. So if you don't have species, you just don't assess it. So if there's no desirable woody species in your shrublands, you don't assess it. Grasslands, you wouldn't assess it. So this is for shrublands and forested areas. And then we look at it, are the species being used, and looking at the browse. So you're looking at regen and browse of those species. Now, moving over to the forested assessment, I looked at down woody debris. So this is where we pulled apart question 2, and I'll show this how it plays out. But we took 5 points out of the woody structure to look at stagnation in the forest and tonnage of down woody debris. This here actually is fuel loading data, so it actually tells you your fire risk as well. And assessing it is fairly simple. We're using just a system where you can look at a number of tables of what it looks, or pictures of what it looks like, to select the most appropriate tonnage. So it's a very easy visual assessment. So what does this look like in actual fact? So you have the range health, and then we have our ecological health side by side. So range health, so question 1, we've added this question with, in question 1, the 32 score, and that's in shrubland and grassland for excessive litter buildup. In our question 2, we have, here's our question 2, and tame woody species I've got in this one form just because it's easier. But if we look here, we've got that same question here, and then we add an extra question for woody expansion, which can get applied to grasslands and shrublands, and looking at the encroachment of specific woody species that are problems, and you can choose not applicable if it's not applicable to your situation. Otherwise, you just give it full marks. Either way, the score comes out basically the same. Later, we've assessed it basically the exact same. And this is where maybe the litter question, we should be making that modification I addressed. Erosion control, we're looking the same. Noxious weeds the same. And here's our preferred trees and shrubs. So woody encroachment is kind of similar to what tame pastures deal with, is what I pulled across into encroachment in our grassland. So I'm not reinventing the wheel a lot. I'm taking ideas that exist elsewhere and applying them in. For our forested systems, the first question is the same. The second question, I took it down to 20 points, breaking out 5 points for the deadfall, and then another 10 points down at the bottom for preferred trees and shrub use. Basically, it nets the same effect, but we can actually understand why things are unhealthy a lot better if we break it apart into what's happening in those structural layers. Is it because of browse and overuse, or are we having a deadfall issue, or are we just having structural changes in the layers? So that's what I'm doing there, is breaking it apart. Otherwise, the questions stay very similar. So Manitoba and Saskatchewan, doing some rough comparisons. We'll do that in our breakout sessions where we're actually going to look at all of these side by side. So that'll actually be part of the assessment. This here just shows a little bit of the output of doing these assessments. So this first one, we have a forested assessment. So you can see here at the top, and even at the bottom here, it's out of 25 or 35. And here you see 20 and 5. So that makes the 25. Got full marks there. Got full marks on its browse at the end, and it ended up in the exact same score, 83% on both of them. So even though they're scored differently, it came out with the same result because everything was healthy. When it's unhealthy, then this starts to differentiate. In the grasslands, I started looking in, and we have woody encroachment happening in this one, and it was buckbrush, and it's moving in from the outside edges, coming from a neighboring community, and just coming in waves around the edges. So in here, we have woody encroachment, it got 0 points and not applicable for the browse. The net result, and then it also had excess litter here. So we knocked it for excess litter, and we went from 97% to 81%, still healthy, but now we have 2 specific areas that need to be addressed in this. And this is an urban park. So there's no fire and there's no grazing. When we looked at another plant community here, This one had naturally high shrub cover, and that's just part of its plant community. We looked at this plant community in the grasslands, and we assessed it for woody encroachment, and it got full marks. It didn't have any encroachment of unexpected woody species. It didn't have browse to assess. So the end result is basically the same score. On this one here, we had poplar encroachment. So we have a shrubland here, poplar encroachment, it gets 0 here. And then there was some heavy use in the shrubland of the Saskatoons and some of those desirable species. Heavy browse, it got hit there, and it ended up with 4% different. So these aren't changing drastically the scores, but they're giving you some specific information. When you pull this out, you have browse information, you have woody encroachment information that you wouldn't have had before. So it's giving you more management tools to work with. That's really the big deal. And this is how the reclamation assessment form looks. So we're going to have breakout sessions where we can go through the questions, and we've got a list of we have some polls here we'll do right away, and then a list of a bunch of questions that we're going to be going through in the breakout sessions. There'll be one for starting in the ecological health and 2 starting the reclamation. And then when we finish, we can move into those other ones, but it allows you to pick the ones that you're most interested in picking apart and really looking at the beginning. There you go.
Would you like me to launch that first poll?
Yeah, let's launch the first poll here.
So we have about 60% of the participants completed. How far or how many, what percentage would be ideal for you?
Let's see if we can get to 75% and then.
Okay.
If we don't move too much, we can also start setting up into our breakout groups.
Sure. We're at like 72, so.
That should be fine.
Okay, I will end the poll. And you'd like me to share the results?
Oh, if somebody has never run, we didn't put if somebody hasn't run an assessment before, they can't submit. So.
Oh.
Because we didn't put none of the above on the second question.
I see.
That was in the chat. Should have put an other or none of the above category, but yeah. So yeah, we've got 66% yes, 34% no. And looks like Saskatchewan 53%, 49% Alberta, 16% Manitoba, and 4% BC. So nice spread in where everybody has done this before.
Oh. So I'll stop sharing now.
Yep.
Okay.
So I think we're ready to break out into our groups.
Okay. So I will open all the rooms now and the participants pick which one. Yeah. So there's a question about how do we pick a room. I would imagine you just click the join button on the room. So for those of you who are left and you haven't picked a room yet, you can pick the reclamation assessment, the second one, as there's no one in there right now.
As we get it. So, okay, so as we get everybody back together here, we'll quickly kind of review some of what discussions were and where we went to, some of the points from the different groups. So I'll kind of review a little bit of what our group discussed, and then we'll just have the other kind of groups feedback from some of their discussions on their topics. So we started out, we're the group that was covering the ecological health assessments. So our coverage was really focused in on looking at the comparison between the different provinces and then the new assessment protocols that I've been pulling together. We have a nice little summary document that we were looking through. This is kind of how it looks. Some of the important feedback that we discussed included looking into whether or not we should have this calculation for the litter score up at the top end here, or as Manitoba's got it set nicely into their retained moisture. And there's actually an argument they said that I think I'll add into this area some scoring in litter. And this here will be a community shifting and just addressing the community shift that can happen a little more detailed. So I might reframe this, and this won't be about as much litter, but when you have that stagnation in the community, which is kind of how I worded it, that you're losing composition of species by going to excessive climax and having no disturbance, where then litter is a more fast responding area. So that was one of the main areas. we had a great discussion about woody regrowth and its importance. Another thing that came up in our soil moisture and litter is to get get into our crusts and actually understand that in here, because litter isn't always the thing that is a driver in our system. So adding in something in some of these systems where we've got this lichen and moss layer that is more biocrust, that is more important than our litter, we should have that built into the questions. So I'm going to look at how to adapt that into these questions. I think that was a really relevant discussion. We've been thinking about it for a while already, dealing with some of the BC areas we have, and BC does have some information on that. So we will be trying to look at incorporation of that. That's our discussion a little bit on the weeds and the different scorings. My scoring is sticking with regulated weeds here because the non-native invasive grasses are addressed up at the top in question 1 fairly heavily. So I don't want to score them twice. So that's kind of where I'm moving with mine at the moment. Definitely I'm open to options if we have some better scoring techniques. There's some slight differentiations in scoring. Manitoba's using a 5-3-1-0. I've got the 6-4-2 and then 4-2-1-0. It might be worth switching this because the forested Alberta assessment uses 5-3-1-0. So maybe making it a little more uniform does make sense. And then we talked about a little bit of adding the shrubland use or woody use in shrublands. And this first question, it wasn't preferred trees and shrubs, it's recruitment and of the trees and shrubs. Are they actually repopulating stuff? Do you have seedlings, saplings? And this is the actual use. So that was kind of our breakdown in that. We did go over forested encroachment and that, and then we talked a bunch about adding an appendix with functional assessments to it. So actually adding a bunch of functional assessments, which I think will is a great idea. And so we're going to look at adding some of those with other people and get some other specialists in there to look at other types of functional groups. And I'm just trying to share this right now. Yeah, so this is the functional assessments and looking at some of the different species groups that we could be talking about, adding as an appendix that could be then taken by anybody who's assessing and say, you know, you've got an area with burrowing owls. Well, then you should run the assessment to say what quality is the burrowing owl habitat. Yeah, so that's kind of ours. For the groups that were working in the reclamation assessments, do you have some feedback of what you guys were discussing?
So we ended up just doing one reclamation group, and Ashley and I worked together on doing the discussion on that. So based on the questions, we had a couple of things in terms of the first question for anybody that wasn't in the reclamation, that just deals with seedling density counts. And the feedback that we got was that they need to be ecoregion specific. And for the grass seedling counts, we need to change the unit of measure from a meter squared to a Daubenmeier.
And I can definitely, we quickly discussed that on our side, and we were saying that having even a table that allows for different sized plots, because in a lot of systems, you don't want to have a square meter too big.
No, and so kind of similar when it comes to the forested side is that we need to have planting densities that are reflected in different forest types and different ecoregion types. So we can't just have a overarching density for that. So what it may come down to, Steve, is we need to split the form into grassland and forested.
I agree with that. So we'll split the grassland, and then I think what it is having a table for like you said, the different, like we do with litter, different forest types will have different target densities. Same thing with grasslands, you have different target densities for your establishing plants for the different natural subregions. So I like that idea.
Okay, so for the question number 2, when it comes to layers present, we kind of said that we may need to just totally eliminate the year one grassland unless you can identify seedlings. If you can identify the seedlings and you can take species specific and attribute structure based on species, then you could leave it in there. But chances are you're not going to be able to identify seedlings in year one. So but the complication with that becomes, how do you take those 10 points and attribute them to other scoring, because you would have to have a separate form then for year one.
Yeah, well, and I have it in here with this form. We could run it where year one just doesn't get applied. So you can just say not applicable in year one, and we could just put them somewhere else. One could be up in the top one with seedling density.
Yeah. So, okay, for question number 3, when it comes to litter, what the feedback was on this was that we might need to have, especially for probably year 1, even to 3 to 4, have a separate category or have a comment in there for introduced litter, say from crimping or pre-existing material to natural litter that is being contributed to the site from your desired species.
Yeah, and we may have to scale the litter a little differently with expectations. So you give some little table or something what you'd expect in your 1, 2, 3 type of situations.
Yeah. So for question number 4, for the most part, this was pretty good. Talked about maybe adding something in there for soil color and taking out the admixing from the soil structure and putting it into the soil color instead. And
I like that. Yeah.
And then the second part of that is that we may need to have either some sort of guidance in the handbook for number of assessment points. The number of assessment points isn't necessarily critical for the vegetation side, although we could specify for how many frames or how many assessment points you should take for density. But 1 point on, if we're going to use this as a measure in oil and gas, 1 soil measure point on a 1 hectare well site is probably not representative. So we probably need to have some guidance for how many assessment points, and say for things like access roads and on-site. So we could maybe even modify or kind of use the assessment point guide in the DSA criteria as kind of a guide for this as well.
Yeah, well, I think it might be worth having a couple different options, because you could have one for like those small well site and those type of facility ones, and then one that's a little different where you're talking about mines and like quarter sections being converted to, and things like that, large scale areas. You still need to have multiple assessment points. So we were commenting that I needed to do something about the admixing one, because having 2 criteria in the same question doesn't work well.
Yeah, and admixing works, from my experience, admixing works best when you kind of incorporate it into color.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so
that's great.
For question number 5, the biggest feedback we got here was that we need to have, or it would be useful to have, a combination of noxious and invasive or undesirables, and whether we split that out and have a scoring for noxious and a scoring for invasives. It was kind of split. It didn't really seem to matter that much, but at least maybe have the option to include more things than just noxious weeds, because from a restoration and reclamation perspective, we may have invasive species that are causing more issue than noxious weeds.
That's a good point. Maybe that is, I don't want to include them together, but I like having a separate question that looks at them. So, and we may have that ability to do that fairly well if we look at some of those extra points in the top end, and some of that, I think it can fit in really well.
Sorry, I just want to chime in here too, Steve and Darren. Darren, something else we talked about with the soils was potentially separating scores for subsoils and topsoils, because if you have issues in your subsoils, or if you just have issues in your topsoils, like you're looking at different equipment you might need, you're looking at different levels of disturbance, things like that.
Yeah, and that's a good question, is whether it should score differently, or should we have a little table in here to tell you where the problem was? Or because
that would be super useful. Yeah, like looking at like a table that would have the depth and then the potential issue.
Yeah, because then you can keep your scoring quite simple, and it's a fast moving scoring system, but you're collecting that exact right data that you need. It's like we have this, like the weed density and distribution cover things. You have a little table on the side on the form that gives you that, the categorization of where was it, what is the, what's the issues. Yeah, some of that.
Yeah, the other thing that I forgot that I just remember now is we suggested putting in something for coarse fragments and stoniness if it's been changed from the control reference.
That's a good idea. And see, in this form, I have a big species listing. That entire area could disappear into something for soils, just so that you can collect a little table that collects the information that you were seeing.
Yeah.
That way you can summarize it and then you score it. And then for my group, when I were mentioning, I have the current community here on this form, and then the references. So if we had two different reference communities we're considering, so on the form, we can actually look back at what we were calling our reference communities. That carried over to the reclamation form here, but that is a very useful to know what is your current community and what was your original targets. Does anybody else have any other feedback? We've got a few minutes left. I'm hoping that to share this and get some people to test these. So revising these, hopefully get some testing, and then have a group of people giving feedback into this. The goal is to make something that's useful for people. So if it's not useful, nobody uses it. So hopefully getting more people involved over the next year and try to actually create something that's a useful tool. And it's meant to be something you can use that'll check where your trajectories are. And the same with the other health assessments, and creating these wildlife metrics. I need wildlife biologists, I need other people to feed information in to hopefully create something that's going to be useful to be used almost anywhere. So even if you're using like the Saskatchewan health assessment on project, you could pull that appendix and score something. So it means that you can actually utilize some other functional tools. I guess that's pretty much it. We're pretty much running out of time here as well. I don't have too much more. So I guess we can probably break for a break before the end here.
Sure. Do you want, if anyone's like interested in like testing this summer, do you want them to contact you directly?
Yeah, if people want to contact me directly, because hopefully we'll be doing another update for the document here. So then you can get whatever the new updates are when we've incorporated some of this feedback. And anybody who wants to get in touch with me on it, I'm happy to work with them on it.
And so all of these files you can find in FeedLoop in this current form.
Yeah.
Like if you were to scroll down below the abstract, there would be all these like forms.
Yeah.
And everything that was, I guess, shared today.
Yeah. So basically you have enough to run it as it is without any updates as it is right now. And I'd love to have, if people are updating it, giving me feedback on things they'd like to improve, because the goal here is to create something that's usable for everybody. And I want it to be shared around. And yeah, like I said, if anybody else in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, if they're working on their documents, I'm happy to have people stealing ideas from me. So.
Okay, well, awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen, and the rest of the Tanis Conservation Services crew. So that concludes our case study this afternoon. You're welcome to, I guess, leave this session and go check out the trade show booths or the poster session. It's not like a designated time for those, but you can go read them. And otherwise, we will meet you here tomorrow morning for the water session. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.